The problem was the government found that it was having budget deficit problems, and because of the inflation, they had to raise the Social Security payments more, and that was going to cost them more than they wanted. So they looked at ways to change the reporting of inflation to reduce the headline inflation, to change what up until that point in time had been a measure of a constant standard of living. And they moved it over to what became a measure of a declining standard of living.
Welcome to the Gold Republic Podcast. My name is Bart Brands.
And I'm Alexei Jordanov. In our weekly podcast, we invite guests from all over the world to get valuable insights
into the emergence of a new monetary system through the lens of precious metals, cryptocurrencies, and other financial instruments. Welcome to a new episode of the Gold Republic Podcast. Today we are interviewing the one and only John Williams of ShadowStats.com. John is a major in economics. He started econometric modeling, and after his family's business of selling chainsaws ended, he started an economic forecasting company with a business partner. Of course, we all know that economic forecasting company as ShadowStats.com. Today, of course, we are going to talk about inflation, what drives inflation, and how we might go into a hyperinflationary situation. Inflation and the definitions of inflation. What do you believe is the best definition of inflation?
Well, and if you're talking about what inflation means, it is effectively the purchasing power of a currency over time against the rising prices. It's a measure of what a constant basket of goods cost in today's dollars against, let's say, a year ago or 10 years ago. And the difference there is the rate of inflation, the aggregate price increase that has taken place in that fixed basket of goods. You want to have a constant base for comparison. And where I got into this, I started after family business was sold to the manufacturer in Germany, and I started my own econometric forecasting firm. What you do with econometric models is you work out relationships between different numbers and what you're trying to forecast, and then if you can get an idea as to where your underlying numbers are going, which is what you can do if you have a leading relationship. And that's what I did. I put together a series of models that had driving factors that all had a leading relationship to what I was trying to forecast. You can come up with some forecast meaningful forecast. And that was, oh my goodness, that was at least 20 years ago, I guess. What I did very simply was I could put together things such as consumer confidence or income and say retail sales. But there's a limited time frame if you're using leading indicators as to how far you can go into the future. There are big scale econometric models that they can tell you anything and they'll go out 3 or 4 years. The only problem is if you're going beyond about 7 months, you can't predict anything based on what's already happened. There you're making underlying assumptions. So that if you wanted to know, let's say, what the unemployment rate was going to be next year, you're effectively guessing at it, or the rate of inflation next year. That you had to guess. So what I did was I put together a package forecasting things about 7 to 9 months into the future with a fair degree of accuracy. Sold it and had some pretty good success with that early on, except in 1981 or two, I guess it was 1981 or two, the government decided to change the way it calculated inflation. Now, what happened here, you go back to 1971, Nixon abandoned the gold standard. And up to that point in time, inflation and the price of gold had moved pretty well against each other in terms of the U.S. dollar. In fact, if you look at gold over time, gold effectively is money. It is a measure of real purchasing power. What you could buy in ancient Rome with a certain amount of gold or certain amount of silver in terms of a loaf of bread, you could do the same thing today. I was at a monetary conference in New York City, 5 years ago, I guess. And a fellow there raised a question. He said, my mother, when she was a little girl, would be taken to a Broadway show by her family, and they'd always get a third row center seat, which is considered the prime seat there. It only cost them $5. And he says, today it's just unbelievable. You can't, it's so expensive. The point I made to him was that if his mother had that $5 gold piece that her parents had used to buy the ticket back in the 20s, she'd still be able to get that same seat on Broadway. It preserves the purchasing power over time. So does silver, but gold is the primary one here. And so when Nixon abandoned gold, all of a sudden we started to see some faster inflation, and gold prices also rose. But we're no longer directly linked to the dollar as to the monetary policy. And come the early 80s, the rate of inflation had picked up enough that people in Congress and the administration were really quite nervous about where it was going. Think of today's circumstance and where people may be nervous now, but because there's a cost of living adjustment made to people on Social Security, which is the support program for people who've retired in the United States. They pay a portion of their income over time into it, and then when they retire, they get paid a certain amount, and a fixed amount. But the government adjusts that with the rate of inflation so that they can maintain a constant standard of living. The problem was the government found that it was having budget deficit problems, and because of the inflation, they had to raise the Social Security payments more, and that was going to cost them more than they wanted. So they looked at ways to change the reporting of inflation to reduce the headline inflation, to change what up until that point in time had been a measure of a constant standard of living. And they moved it over to what became a measure of a declining standard of living. For example, the first change they made was to housing costs. And if you look at the headline Consumer Price Index, the CPI as we call it, a major portion of that is housing cost for people. People have to live someplace. Back in those days, before they made the change, they included as part of that, an element of that index was the cost of buying a new house. Because some people would be buying new houses. They scrapped the whole concept and changed it, redefining it to what they called a homeowner's equivalent rent. What a homeowner would rent his house to himself for, and the actual inflation measure was the rate of change that he'd raise the rate on himself each month. Whatever he'd raise the rate on what he's charging himself for rent, that was what went into the number. Well, of course, there's no way of measuring that. The government made good guesses at it, and the effect was that they reduced the total, not just the housing cost, but the total CPI by 1.5 percentage points as a result of that one change, and that's ongoing over time. To put that in perspective, last year, the year-to-year change in the CPI was 1.3%. That one item alone, if they left it intact, you would have seen it double that in terms of the headline CPI. But they made a lot of changes over time, enough so that the aggregate changes add up to about in the range of 6 to 7 percentage points, and that's a big difference. When people in the United States on Social Security will claim they can't make ends meet. They may have been able to do it one time, but the cost of living adjustment has been artificially depressed by the way the government has calculated the number. So what I did was I went back and I looked at the changes that were made, and the government's very open about it. They published the numbers, what they did, how much they figured this reduced the headline inflation by, and I reverse engineered it. So I published an alternative measure. I call it the ShadowStats alternate CPI. And there's, again, a very significant difference there. And as you go forward here, we're writing now on top of the rise in the headline CPI. So the headline CPI is up a little over, let's say 5.5%. You're approaching 13% with my measure. What I found, though, was that, and it took me a while to actually get around to this, but I should have done it up front. One day I said, well, let me just plot my measure against the price of gold, see how that looks. And I plotted it, the headline inflation going back to the beginning of the American colonies up to date. And the price of gold as well. But there becomes a division after 1982 in the CPI because you have the headline CPI, and then you have my number. And what I found, I didn't even have to change the index, was that the gold went right up with my measure. In fact, it led my measure a little bit. But my measure and the gold price have been broadly consistent over time, with gold having a little leading relationship. And where my measure is right now, and if I only did this against year end, but where my index is right now would suggest that at the end of the year we're going to be somewhat over $2,000 in the price of gold. That would be consistent with what is your constant standard of living, your constant purchasing power over time. That gives you a little idea of what I've done there. But
it does. It definitely does. And also, I think we also agree that inflation might be one of the hardest, if not the most complex, and also in a way mystical, a part of an economy. It also has to do with expected inflation that consumers have, and basically prices in also what the modeling and forecasts of all kinds of different institutions do, just like the Federal Reserve. And this is also one of the things we would like to break down with you, is to see how in detail is it measured and what the nuances are, because we, for one part, and you just mentioned it, talk about Consumer Price Index, CPI, but it also appeared a few years ago in the minutes of the Fed that they actually prefer to use the personal consumption expenditure, the PCE. Mm-hmm. What is the difference there, and why do they prefer to take the personal consumption expenditure? Perhaps also for the listeners and viewers who are not very familiar with all those terms, give a little definition of those two concepts and the differences of them.
Well, the primary difference is what is the use going to be of the measure. If you're trying to come up with a reasonable cost of living for people, so the person you say you take, you're looking at the nation on average. So it's going to be different for different people, but on average, if you have what I would consider an accurate measure of consumer inflation, then people generally would say, "Yep, that's fair. If my income is that much higher, I should be able to make ends meet." From the standpoint of the government, they want the lowest measure possible, and the Fed has it even lower than the federal government. It makes them look good. Like we have inflation under control. Yeah, it's so heavily gimmicked. It's nonsensical. Give you some examples. Back in I think it was 2005, there was an effort to change the measure of the Consumer Price Index the CPI-U, despite the fact it had been redefined over time, to use the research, what they call the research series, which has every the CPI-U, which is a chain-weighted dollar. The difference between a chain-weighted and a fixed-weighted is whether or not you're buying steak or chicken. And the way Alan Greenspan argued it was that people maybe like steak, but the steak gets too expensive to buy chicken. That's true, but that's not a constant standard of living. That's not the way the CPI was defined for the average person who's buying things. The average person wants to continue to be able to buy steak. You change it the way Greenspan wanted, and the way that a lot of the measures are now, and you get to the PCE inflation number. That's all chain weighted. It has nothing to do with people maintaining a constant standard of living. So that if you put in chicken instead of steak, sure, your index comes down, but the people are not getting enough compensation to maintain their standard of living. And it's not just they look to the government for, okay, that's what's going to happen to my cost of living, but they use this as a target as well for their own income. If inflation's up 5%, you want to be making more than 5% increase each year in your income. So it's the numbers that they put forth from the standpoint of being usable for government purposes are artificially depressed. They do not have the measure of being a constant standard of living. It's a price measure, yes, but it's not the type of price measure you want being used on your income if you're trying to maintain a constant standard of living.
John, thank you. How are hedonics and substitutions examples of lowering inflation numbers? How are they used?
Well, it's a matter of how you're compiling the final measure. I mean, if you're measuring the cost of a particular cut of beef, you can track that over time. And you might be looking at a certain type of hamburger, and you can track that over time. The question is, when you combine all the pieces, how you weight them to come up with an aggregate inflation number. And if people are finding that they don't have enough income, they'll tend to cut back in, let's say, the more expensive product, the steak, and they'll buy the hamburger. And in doing so, if you then look at you see that shift. If the government shifts that number to use a weighting that it reflects the move to the substitution, that reduces the headline inflation rate. I mean, if using very simple. If people buy a 20% steak and 80% hamburger, and because the steak gets so expensive, they cut to 10% steak and 90% hamburger. If you priced out those meat purchases divided by the volume of meat, you'd have a lower inflation for the broad category of meat, without having the specific set weighting of the steak or hamburger. I don't know if that helps.
It does, John. It does.
There's also and this is also, I think, a very important fact of. So now we've seen a bit like how the reporting of itself is done within the certain ways of measuring inflation, but then there's also the number itself. We have inflation rate, which headline inflation is about. Correct me if I'm wrong. The officially reported by the Federal Reserve, 5-point-something%. But then there's also the argument that is also used by the Fed that look at the rate of change. So here we have the difference between the actual inflation rate and then inflation, the rate of change from month over month, year over. What is it? Would you say the fundamental distinction between the two, and how does it play in also the more psychological aspect of it in the way it comes across on markets and the public itself?
Well, I think the most common measure as the public looks at it is the month-to-month measure, and that's seasonally. They seasonally adjust the numbers because there will be times when you have, let's say, seasonal spikes in oil prices or gasoline. So they tend to smooth that out so that you have a fairly consistent number over a year. I look at it as on a year-over-year basis. And when you look at it on a year-over-year basis, that almost doesn't need seasonal adjustment because by definition, you're going December against December, June against June. But you can also look at it on a seasonally adjusted basis. And on a seasonally adjusted basis, year to year should be about the same. In terms of the cost of living adjustments that they do in the United States, they take a quarterly average of one of the CPI measures. It's all urban consumers, but it has the same changes made to it as the CPIU, which is a headline number, and they measure that on a year-over-year basis. They take an average for the third quarter this year, third quarter last year. This year it's going to be up 5-6%. Last year it was up 1.8%. That's going to put a dent in their deficit next year, and that's with the understated inflation. I mean, instead of being up, say 6%, it should be up 13% this year, and it should have been up 7% last year. So it's a big difference between where the reality is now, and that's in terms of constant standard of living. It's more than just a substitution. For example, you go shopping. You might like to buy your clothes at a tailor. You suffer some income loss, or you're not making it quite as you used to. Then you go to a discount store and you pick up your clothes ready made, and it's cheaper. As malls have developed, there's been a big shift in pattern. All sorts of things get shifted in these equations as to how things are priced and how the prices are sampled. But the numbers to start with are not seasonally adjusted. They go out, they sample all sorts of stores. It's the Bureau of Labor Statistics that does the surveying here. They send people out to the stores to check prices. They do a variety of surveying. They look at advertisements. But right now we have this government, good parts of the government still shut down because of the COVID crisis. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is not going out and sampling prices. They make some phone calls, but they don't go out and take a look. And where that makes a difference right now is in areas that what people call shrinkflation. I don't know if you've heard that, you have that term, but for example, in order to keep the prices low, a manufacturer will maybe cut 100 sheets of paper off a roll of paper towels and sell it for the same price as before. Now, normally the Bureau of Labor Statistics would pick that up because they go out and when they look at certain products that they sample, they take the exact measure and they note it, and then they check it next time around. And if you're getting 900 sheets instead of 1,000 sheets of paper, they'd be picking that up, and that'd be a 10%, in fact, roughly 10% inflation hike in that particular product. You're seeing a lot of that happening now. They also have problems. Again, the Bureau of Labor Statistics in surveying unemployment. You hear Chairman Powell of the Federal Reserve saying, well, the unemployment number is not too meaningful. It's surveyed by the same people who do the inflation numbers, and they have the same problem. They're not out talking to people head on head. They talk with them on the phone. They can't count things right. They admit they can't count things right. We're not getting accurate inflation numbers, headline inflation numbers. We're not getting accurate economic numbers. That includes the GDP and the unemployment. But I know we're concentrating on the inflation. And when you get to the Fed, yes, they're trying to target their special inflation rate, the personal consumption expenditures, net of food and energy. That's their core measure, net of food and energy, as though people don't have to pay for food or energy or the inflation in food and energy. Those are areas that are typically very volatile and tend to be high, but they're not counted here because that helps to keep the number down. And the other they bring it in at under 2%, but even the GDP deflator, which is on what this is based, is higher than that, and the GDP is fully substitution based. It's based on actual volumes of different products and the prices in place at the time. So there's no the GDP price deflator is a broad measure for the economy, but it includes many areas that the average person doesn't see. The average person doesn't have to pay payrolls, for example. So it's the CPI was designed initially as a way of measuring, again, constant standard of living. It worked well. People lived with it, and until the early 80s, no one was complaining about it too much, except some economists saying, "Oh, it's too high. We've got to bring it down." And for the politicians to bring it down, it helped them with their budget. And there's another advantage to understating inflation, and this is particularly for the government, also for the Federal Reserve, and that is that most economic measures that you see reported, such as the GDP, for example, are adjusted for inflation. Now, some series like retail sales, which is out of the Commerce Department, they report it just as they get it, nominal terms, not adjusted for inflation, so that when you have a period of high inflation, you can see surging retail sales, but that's not necessarily what's happening in the physical volume as it would get measured in the real GDP. The GDP is adjusted for inflation standardly, gives you a constant measure of how the quantity of goods is moving, as opposed to just the inflation-driven number, which you also have of the nominal GDP. But you look at the retail sales. The retail sales have been booming, but if you take out the CPI, the headline CPI, retail sales have been contracting. And in fact, they're heading into a contraction for this third quarter. That's a thing that is going to affect Fed policy. The Fed is supposedly going to be tapering. If they're saying, well, the economy is recovering and we're in good shape now. Nothing to worry about, right? Except all of a sudden the economy's retrenching. And this last round of employment reports, and Chairman Powell mentioned it, the employment numbers in August were very weak. You actually had a contraction in retail sales employment. Leisure and hospitality, which is the restaurants and bars and gaming casinos and things like that, which is so heavily hit, had made a big comeback, but all of a sudden that flattened out. You had construction. Construction boomed early on in the pandemic here, but now the employment there is in contraction, and all the employment numbers have been in quarterly contraction. You get 2 quarterly contractions in the GDP, that gives you a recession usually. We haven't had that yet, but the headline GDP is, other than the pandemic effect, you had to crash the economy, and then it's come back, but it has not fully recovered. And that's the full recovery is something the Fed's looking for. They advertise. Inflation a little bit above 2%. That people say, yeah, it's going to stay above 2%. That's what they're looking for. They've got the inflation well above that now, and with the amount of money that they're creating, which was done in theory to create the inflation to support the economy. It is there have been some funny things done with those numbers, but if you look at the headline, the narrowest measure as I look at it, which is what used to be the M1, the currency plus checking deposits, that's now up something like 93% from where it was at the beginning of the recession, the pandemic and recession. They're given a coincident starting point. You've never seen anything like that in the United States, and that's why you're beginning to see the surge in inflation here. The monetary base, which is the direct Fed policy, that's up something like 83% since the beginning of the pandemic. Now, it's not at an all-time high because you had a collapse of the banking system back in the what we call the Great Recession back in 2007. And at that time, the Fed did everything it had to keep the banking system afloat. That's the Fed's primary function in life. It's not to keep the economy strong. It's not to keep inflation down, although they adopt that. Their primary function is to keep the banking system afloat. That's what they've been doing here. It is back at the time of the 2007 collapse, you saw the bank reserves up by 5,000%, unprecedented. But they never brought it back down. They brought it down a little bit, but still those reserves stay in the system. And now, outside of that Great Recession, the reserves are up something like 150% since the onset of the recession and the pandemic. There's a problem in the banking system that they have to keep afloat. And when they talk of this tapering, where they pull back on the money supply, this last meeting, that's when Chairman Powell started hemming and hawing a little bit, because if you read the minutes, it says, we've made tremendous progress against the pandemic, and yes, sure, things are a lot better than they were at the trough, but it's far from recovered. And he said, if we fall back here, and he starts to cite the recent numbers, which we are doing. There's a lot of evidence that the economy in the United States is slowing down. They might have to push back again when they're going to start tapering and cutting back on the money supply. I don't think we're going to see a tapering at least for another year or so. And at that point, you could very easily have a hyperinflation in the United States.
All right.
Could I make 2 quick points
sure.
on that one? In terms of the recovery, if you look at the headline GDP, gross domestic product, broadest measure in the economy, real terms, it actually has just recovered its pre-pandemic high. But the GDP right now is one of those numbers that is not getting very well surveyed and reported. In fact, it looks like the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which does the reporting, pretty much uses the model of the Atlanta Fed, which is called the rate, a 0.1% throughout this extreme period. The New York Fed abandoned its model. It says we're suspending it. We can't make things work here. The numbers that we're getting here are not of extraordinary quality. The only series I see out there that's regularly published by the government that I'm comfortable with is payroll employment. The reason for that is that rather than having the government having to survey or guesstimate from other things, the payroll survey is it's gathered by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but it's based on tax filings by companies that actually are employing people. They pay them payroll taxes. It's a hard number, and if you look at that, and I've gone back and I've looked at it back to before World War II. If you look at the peak in payroll employment at this onset of a recession to its trough, how far it goes to its trough, what happened with the pandemic is the worst ever. I mean, you're down something like 14%. Outside of that, it was the Great Recession. It's down about 7%. But with every other recession, it's been a lot less than that. Now, where we stand right now, we've recovered quite a bit, but the headline numbers in August, and they're not going to be much better come September, which comes out Friday of this week. It's still down 3.5% from its pre-pandemic peak, pre-recession peak. That is a deeper decline than seen at the trough of any of the last 7 recessions back to 1957, except for the 2007 Great Recession. This is not a recovery, and the economy is beginning to pull back now. I think you're going to see some very harsh numbers coming out that will all of a sudden push the concept of the tapering back, and we're going to get more and more money supply from the Fed.